Hello, everyone, and we're sorry for the tech technical glitches, but that happens. So we're going to option two. I'm so glad to be doing this talk, and I'm so thankful to the Plainfield Public Library, the Drake House Museum, and the Historical Society of Plainfield that all of these institutions are hosting this event today, and I'm very pleased to be your participant and speaker. I have been working in genealogy for more than 20 years. History and genealogy are very important to me, and I think important to people around the world today. At some point in our lives, we have this internal quest to know who we are and where we came from. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to have known parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, etc., there is a longing at some point to you want to know more about them and, how our families were constructed and other things about other data, history and other data about the places of origin where we began. So again, I'm going to start. I'm going to do this presentation in two parts because I was asked to talk about, to give you some information and strategies for conducting research if you are from the Caribbean and that's where your roots are. But I also think it's important that I go over some basic genealogy information and strategies because Caribbean research, it is all somewhat nuanced, but Caribbean research is a bit more nuanced and requires another level of skill because, there's so many facets to it in terms of how our families operated, the facts that in many places another country had jurisdiction over a Caribbean island, perhaps. So there may be language differences, et cetera. So it's a bit more nuanced, than general genealogy. So I'm going to go over some basic, genealogy first, and then move forward to telling you about, how to conduct genealogy if your roots are in the Caribbean. Understanding that as a beginning researcher, your task is a doable one. It may be challenging, exciting, and sometimes frustrating. A frustrating journey about finding the facts requires one's, thinking about one's ancestors and ultimately oneself. Please note that this is not a marathon, but a self-paced exploration. There will be triumphs, but you will also find brick walls along the way. Know that there are ways to navigate these challenges. If you are a person who is short on patience, genealogy will teach you to learn to be patient, as you will sometimes have to wait for information to be revealed or to be sent to you. And for those of you who are researching the Caribbean, and you'll probably hear me state this again, the pace of life, the socialization is quite different than in the United States. There are differences in terms of how you access information. People do take lunch hours, so if you are fortunate to go on site to do research, don't be upset if you arrive and the staff, which is generally smaller, is taking their lunch hour, etc. Life works at a different pace and a different rhythm than here in the United States. If there are family secrets, try to get the information and the source who holds the information by engaging family members. but do this with integrity. You will be asking for information that may have been a secret, that may have been difficult for people to talk about, and so you want to make these family connections, but do it in a time-sensitive way and also with integrity. If the respondent asks you to please not fully disclose the information that you are receiving, remember to honor that request. And emphasize that you're only going to use that portion of the information that furthers your research. Know that at times this can be an emotional process, and there are, many considerations and issues and attitudes that may come up. It may reveal trauma, anger, frustration, and knowing that the persons that you're researching may have been enslaved. Is dealing with slavery documents and the process of finding out facts of enslavement can sometimes be challenging and very emotional. Getting ready for the research process. Why are you embarking on this journey? What is it that you want to know? This consideration will inform your first steps. Beginning with yourself and continuing to work backwards in time. Record what you know about yourself and your ancestors. Begin the process by adopting good research methodology and using certain forms, which I will describe, to organize your research, because eventually you're going to be collecting a lot of paper. And so you want to make sure that you have carved out a place in your home, your office, wherever you're going to conduct this research, to assemble your materials and the data you will be collecting, whether that's print material, whether it's books, whether it's photographs or whatever. Carve out a place where you'll put all this material, because you won't want the frustration of getting to a point in your research and then not knowing where your data belongs or where your data is. You want to record materials, as I said, in a timely and appropriate fashion. When and where were people born? Where did they live? When and where did they die? You need these important 2 or 3 pieces of information on an individual that you may be seeking to find. So you need the person's name. And later on I'll talk about, for those of you who are researching the Caribbean, socially and culturally, there was a tradition, and probably is still held, where the person may have a given name or first name, but they may also have a series of other nicknames. Or in decades past, there was a tradition of giving people 3 and 4 names. Here we're used to a first name and perhaps a middle name. In Caribbean traditions, a person may have 3 or 4 names. So when you're looking for someone, all of the information that you can collect before you actually do research is beneficial. The answers to these questions will form the basis of the data you will use as you complete your ancestor or pedigree chart. There are research logs which will help you, because if you're going to do, whether it's online research, you're going to a repository, or wherever you're going, it's important to keep track of what you were looking for. Did you or did you not find it? If you found it, how and in what capacity did you find it? Was it in a pamphlet? Was it in a book? Was it something online or whatever? So you want to keep track of this information, because later on, when you've collected a body of information, you don't want to have to scratch your head and say, oh, gee, where did I find this? And ultimately, if you are successful at some point and want to write up your history, it is only valid if you can verify your information and your sources. You want to interview family members, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, even neighbors, and anyone who was in contact with the individual or individuals that you are searching. You never know where information might come to you, and you never know who's holding information, so don't discount anyone. There are many free online examples of oral history questions that you can utilize. Oral history in our communities is very important because historical information and historical data is often passed orally as well as written. So you want to make sure that you're collecting oral histories as much as possible. Sometimes oral history is used to stimulate conversation. When you approach family members, and you'll have to gauge how to approach family members or contacts, associates, cousins, whomever, in what ways. Sometimes our older relatives aren't as quick to offer information. Sometimes they think that because those of us who may be younger are more used to conversing about these details and perhaps more open, know that they may be a little bit more closed, and you may have to find ways to engage them. Or if you're not the person who can engage a particular relative, then see if there's a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, a sister, a brother, somebody who they're very, very close to, who they may be more comfortable talking to, and you may ascertain the information that way. Make sure that you are reaching out. Make a list of all the people in your family that you think can be of help to you in this quest. And be sure to interview the older members of your family first, while their health permits and their memories are intact. So you want to make sure that when you assemble this list of family members, that you go to the older members of the family first. And also because given the longevity of their lives, they possibly have a lot more information than you may think initially. Organization is essential when you begin to do your research and as you continue to assemble all kinds of data and material. Make sure that you have enough, sharpened pencils and pens and notepads, recording devices. Make sure that your mobile phone, that your, is charged, that your, camera is in good working order, that you have serviced your computer and tablets and whatever, so that, when you start to do this research, you can keep going. You want to look at and find out who has, family Bibles, heirlooms, photo albums, and other material in their possession that, might be helpful in your consultation. And then there are, as you're accumulating material, you want to store it properly. So there are companies that will help you do this, such as Gaylord University Products. That's one that I really, really like. They've been, consistent in producing archival quality folders and materials and various things that you will need to secure your documents. you will be collecting a lot of documents, papers, photographs, and other important material that you'll want to preserve and safeguard. And see what you may have at home. There may be diplomas, school papers, baptismal certificates, confirmation certificates, birth certificates, employment records, baby books, family Bibles, death certificates, funeral programs, prayer cards, photographs, letters, postcards, diaries, journals, marriage certificates, and other documents. So you want to see what there is that you can readily put your hands on, especially when you begin your research, because as you go to documents in online sources, in libraries and repositories, you want to have as much of a body of information as you can initially assemble. Here is where organization and documentation is of prime importance. Develop the habit of documenting everything you review, analyze, and research. Prepare a research log and let that be your companion. Every time you call someone, text, email, or do research, you want to make sure that you are indicating this on your research log and the source. And if it's a book, you want to make sure you have the title, the author, date of publication. If there's a specific chapter in that book that was helpful to you in gaining historical or other information, you want to make sure you indicate the chapter and the pages. It may not seem that important initially, but later on it will, because as you collect a body of material and information, you may have to go back to a particular source to identify more information or to reread it, because as you gain more information and more experience and your analysis becomes, more expert, you may want to go back to a source to re-examine material that you've assembled. So organization is key. You should also begin to research and assess the social, community, and cultural aspects of the lives that your ancestors lived. When you have compiled a level of data and you are comfortable, you can begin to upload the information collected onto online genealogical software, such as Family Tree Maker. There are many, different ones. I'll just mention a few: Legacy and Roots Magic. This will also help you to record and safeguard the material contained in the transcribed oral histories. There are many record sources and repositories. Cast a wide net with regard to record sources and repositories. They can be found at the federal, state, and local level. Eventually, everything becomes local in terms of where your family resided. So, there are just a number of sources. Some federal sources include the biennial or every 10-year federal census, which, as you may know, began in 1790. Birth, death, and marriage records. And there are many non-population schedules, such as mortality schedules, which were accumulated from 1850 to 1880. Agricultural schedules, if that is pertinent, from 1850 to 1880. Manufacturing, 1820 and 1850 to 1880. And another record source, which was accumulated for defective, dependent, and delinquent individuals in 1830. There are many sources at the state level, often taken at the 5-year point in between federal censuses. So, there's Social Security and death indices and, many different types of sources that you will eventually want to consult, depending upon the situation with your individual family and where they may have resided. Don't discount the military for those who may have served in the military. Every military engagement from the Revolutionary War forward has produced records. There were approximately 180,000 individuals, black individuals, who were part of what's called the United States Colored Troops. So that can be a source of information. And then there are all sorts of court records, probate records, wills, and estates. If your background and your ancestors or family members emigrated from another country, then you will want to look at immigration and naturalization records eventually. If the individual did not become a citizen, then there are alien registration records and also passport applications. After enslavement, the federal government created what's known as the Freedmen's Bureau, which existed from 1865 to 1872. There are over 30 branches in 17 states and Washington, D.C. of the Freedmen's Bureau. This was created, this program was created to assist formerly enslaved persons. The data, and it includes data about marriages, medical issues, rations, housing, migration, and other materials. Also, a related document, a related information source, was the Freedmen's Bank. The Freedmen's Bank was enacted to allow formerly enslaved persons to have, these accounts, and sometimes, depending upon who offered the information, it can be very, very information rich, because persons would tell information about themselves. There may be mention of a former or the last slaveholder. There's all kinds of information that may have been included in the Freedmen's Bank. There is also a document called the Southern Claims Commission, which was put together from 1871 to 1880. And it contains claims by persons who requested compensation for goods that had been donated or taken by the military during the Civil War. Sometimes testimony of formerly enslaved persons are also included in the Southern Claims Commission. Of course, there are other resources, state libraries, historical societies, and archives, which contain vital records, institutional records, sometimes a record of a hospital or other institution. Of course, there are court records housed in county courthouses, and then there are museums and historical societies. There are also sometimes midwife records, and for some, although this is not a usual, type of document that was assembled for most people, there are also some cohabitation records. Local records, may be sometimes benevolent societies were created, or fraternal organizations, sororities, fraternities, police, and other records. And then, of course, there's a wide range of material that can be looked at, and that's why as I can't state enough, that you want to be organized. You want to start slow and think about, who you want to research, what you want to know about them, because, as you get involved in this process, as fascinating and as enriching as it is, it also can be very consuming in terms of sometimes the emotion of it, sometimes the amount of time it takes, and sometimes the amount of documents that you may have to look at. Because at the local level, there could be sources of newspapers depending upon what your ancestors or family members may have engaged in. Of course, cemetery records. If they attended churches, church records, and sometimes the repositories of denominations. City directors, digital library sources, regarding slavery and other topics, compiled biographies, slave narratives, and other, types of sources. Antebellum and slave ancestral research, which is, again, a nuanced type of research. It's much more nuanced and requires, a more advanced level of research to complete. To do this work, have you started where you are and moved backwards in time to 1870? 1870 is important because it is the first federal census where persons of color are listed by name. Prior to the 1870 census, you would find slave schedules for 1850 and 1860, but enslaved persons were aggregated under the name of the slaveholder and would only be described, by, male, age 40, and sometimes if there were physical characteristics that could be viewed, sometimes there would be a notation of a physical characteristic, but no name, and no really helpful identification of the person. So one would have to do a lot of research before approaching slave schedule. Okay, so as I mentioned, antebellum and slave ancestral research. If the ancestors were enslaved, their data is embedded, as I said, in the history and records of the slaveholder. So, one would have to research the history of slavery generally, and as it was manifested in the state, county, city, town, or rural area where the estate or plantation existed. What records were developed in the localities where the enslavement occurred? Because, of course, it was considered, a business function. So, there may be records within estates, farms, and plantations, some of which are probate records and wills. Usually, if a slaveholder died and his family was pursuing continuing the business or handling his or her estate, then information about your ancestor may be included in those documents. So, one would need to look at annual returns, inventories, bills of sale, estate sales, tax records, contracts for hire, letters, journals, Bibles, account books, diaries, etc. So some of the data that we know generally, but some more specific to the subject of enslavement. And as I mentioned before, 1850 and 1860, there were what is known as slave schedules, and these were assembled to aggregate the number of slaves under the slaveholder's name, Generally, the enslaved, as I said, are not named, but their age, gender, and physical characteristics may be noted. So as you will note, to upgrade, it is necessary to continue to upgrade one's skills and one's research know-how. Knowledge of history is crucial, global, domestic, and of course, local. In terms of upgrading skills, you have the opportunity not only to work individually, but to perhaps join a genealogical society, to subscribe to newsletters, and newsletters of various types. There may be local historical newsletters that were produced. If there are museums and libraries, whether the library is as part of a city or maybe part of a local university, there may be newsletters or materials or histories that have been developed by these sources. So definitely if there is a college or university near the area you are researching, you want to get to know and make friends with the reference librarian, because he or she will be able to point you in the direction of materials that they may house. There may be small libraries or museums or other local entities that maintain artifacts or historical documents or papers related to the area. So you need to do your outreach and find out what materials they may maintain, and possibly consider joining them through membership. I'm not going to talk a lot about DNA. I know that that's the rage these days, but that's a whole other topic, and we have to get to Caribbean history. But it is another tool in the genealogist's arsenal of tools. It is based on science, but I would suggest that after you've accumulated and assembled a good body of knowledge, then and you've analyzed that body of knowledge, so where people are, where they lived, a significant amount about them, then you might seek to consult DNA, as I said, another tool in your arsenal. Technology, of course, continues to advance, so the testing companies continue to upgrade the information to subscribers and what they can utilize to further their research. But it is important to have a body of knowledge before you even approach genealogical DNA, sources. But it can be one more tool in your arsenal. Now, I understand that there are many individuals whose backgrounds are in the Caribbean, and interestingly, so is mine. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about Caribbean history and genealogical quests in terms of the Caribbean. So Caribbean history and thus, genealogical quests represents an amalgam of world history because of the colonization of multiple countries, pre- and post-emancipation. Also, this body of knowledge reflects patterns of immigration and naturalization as people moved by choice and by force from one island to another, and from the West Indies to the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world, and there was cross-migration, as many of us know. Conducting Caribbean research for those with roots in the Caribbean of course, is another branch of the genealogical and historical quest, and again, another nuanced branch. So, my suggestion is that, especially for those who are beginning this quest, get yourself grounded in general genealogical strategies and research first. Because, as I said, approaching, the Caribbean and the research, given, colonization, given that some countries owned another country, some European countries, as we know, owned, administratively, islands in the Caribbean. So, you're dealing with documents that may be in different parts of the world. You're dealing with documents that may need translation. There are many, many factors. So, my suggestion is always get yourself grounded in genealogical strategies first. And think about, what is it that you want to know? Start with your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. The same way you would approach any genealogical study. Let associates and families know that you are asking questions so that you can begin to assemble data about the family history. If information, as I said, is shared in confidence, you must keep the confidence and use for public purposes of your research only that information which you have mutually agreed to disclose. What were the countries of origin? Were languages spoken other than English? Different languages will affect the acquisition of records and other documents. Some records may require a translation, especially older ones. Remember that while genealogy is increasing in interest, methodologies and considerations for acquiring the data in other countries may pose some challenges. Fewer hours of operation may exist in Caribbean islands. Fewer staffs and equipment may exist in Caribbean, libraries or historical societies, or wherever this information may be housed. You may find some challenges, such as a reluctance to have the researcher access or film certain documents. There are going to be different restrictions, and in some places, it's not that people want to be difficult, but culturally, socially, they just have different ideas about what information they should share. And part of the issue is, especially if we're going back many years, or perhaps even centuries, they may seek to protect the document. So there may be things that they might not be willing to show you, or if they're willing to show you, that you may not be able to handle and hold, yourself. So just be sensitive to these kinds of issues. And if you are researching here and you need, documents in another country, be sensitive to the fact that they generally have smaller staffs, and it may take more time to access information, to handle requests for information, etc. I'll just tell you an aside. In my personal experience, I was doing, one of my countries is Barbados, and I was doing research this is going back a few years, but over several months. And the woman that I needed to ask a question to, her desk was just a few feet from the desk of the woman that I was then speaking to. And so it just so happens, and I said, God may have entered that particular exchange, So I was going back and forth for several weeks, probably a couple of months, with this particular individual, and we had, established a relationship, by phone, etc. But the person I needed to talk to get one piece of information, her desk was just a few feet away. But the lady that I initially spoke to never said, oh, why don't you let me put you on hold? Let me let you speak to this other employee. So, as luck would have it, my luck that day, the lady that I really needed to speak to had gone away from her desk, had gone to the ladies' room or whatever, came back, and as we're on the phone, she's passing the desk of the person that I had been, engaging and talking to for months. And finally, the person that I had been talking to said, "Oh, Miss So-and-so, she's just passing my desk." And I quickly said, "Oh, might I talk to her?" And so after weeks and months of this back and forth and long-distance calls to Barbados, I finally got to speak to the person that I needed to. But, as I said, this quest requires patience, tenacity, skill, everything one can think of to engage in a process of communication. So, know that ahead of time. Be patient. Be determined, but be pleasant and positive. The terminology varies with regard to immigrants. So, one needs to know how people of color with roots in the Caribbean may be described in the literature. They may be described as Afro-Caribbean. They may be described as West Indian. They may be described as, Black Americans with Caribbean origins, etc. So knowing, how to focus your research and how people are described is important. Get to know information regarding global history and patterns of migration. For example, from the late 1790s through approximately the early 1880s, some general patterns of migration were prevalent, such as, and I'll provide a few examples, formerly enslaved people of African descent moved between North America and the West Indies. Many early enslaved black people could be transported to America by way of the Caribbean, to various North American colonies, depending upon, and especially if they were enslaved, what the slaveholders' interests were. Sometimes if profitable sources were drying up in the Caribbean, a slaveholder may have decided to seek property and land in the early United States. Also, if depending upon how the slaveholder's family was, constructed, if there were more than one son, and perhaps one son was running the quote-unquote business in a Caribbean island, another son may have wanted to seek his fortune, and so they may have sent him to establish a plantation or estate in the United States. So there are a lot of nuances and a lot of things, going on. For example, South Carolina was the destination for slaveholding families who were seeking to acquire additional land and plantations for the cultivation of rice and indigo. Initially, they brought the enslaved property from Barbados and other Caribbean islands until additional labor needs caused them to import, quote-unquote, property directly, from the continent. In the late 1700s to the early 1900s, as a result of the Haitian Revolution, whites, free enslaved people, and other black Haitian refugees were relocated to coastal cities in the United States, especially Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, which produced, a lot of cultural, and demographic impact. In the late 1700s, after the Revolutionary War, those who sided with the Tories or British Loyalists were evacuated with British forces from the ports of New York, Savannah, eastern Florida, back to the West Indies. Among this population were formerly enslaved black people who had escaped from slavery in southern colonies. They had fought alongside the British to gain their freedom. Southern white loyalists also fled with their human, quote-unquote, property. They relocated to the Bahamas, Jamaica, and the greatest number of these individuals reportedly going to Jamaica. Some of those who resettled in the Bahamas were of the Gullah or Geechee individuals whose cultural origins may be traced to the coastal regions of the Carolina and Georgia. From the 1880 or so to the beginning of the American First World War, immigrants began to seek opportunities in Northern American locations. Due to the economic recession associated with the building of the Panama Canal, also a interesting and important point of departure. New waves of immigration in similar numbers occurred through the 1940s and early 1950s. These were affected by policies of racial bias and some restructuring of, political policies. I'll talk a little bit later about open immigration through 1924. Because of the large numbers of immigrants from the Caribbean, Asia, Africa, and Latin America leading up to World War I, there are federal records regarding immigration available to this period. The main source would be the National Archives and Records Administration, Record Group 85. These records provide information regarding passenger arrival records and also declarations of intent for those who desired to become citizens of the United States. Passengers, listed, there are passengers who are listed, and also ship manifests may be available. The passenger or passenger or port of arrival may differ from the city and state where the individual eventually resided, because people in the early part of the 20th century were very migratory, and so in fact, all kinds of things happened, and this is again knowing culturally what happened in a particular location and socially what was taking place. There were many stories that came from the United States back to the West Indies, and sometimes, especially men, were afraid to come into a port where they would eventually reside. This happened in my family as well. So some of my grandfather and some of my great uncles, landed in Florida or other places and eventually worked their way to New York, because, stories had been written back home that, if they came into New York initially, they may be accosted by immigration authorities or whatever, because, sometimes it was jealousy, sometimes it was other reasons. People may create stories or whatever. So there was a complicated and different situation for whites who came into the country in the early part of the 20th century than blacks who migrated. Naturalization records certainly are housed at the National Archives. and other sources are compiled and stored regarding immigration and naturalization. This information typically included dates of birth, countries of origin, and the date and port of entry into the United States, as well as other pertinent personal data. This information began to be compiled from 1906 and generally continued pretty late into the 20th century, approximately 1995. The National Archives and Records Administration maintains regional offices. So the regional offices house, material specific to that particular region or locale and geographic area. Some sources, sources such as Ancestry.com, also maintain digital versions of these records. Census Group records, Record Group 29, Federal Record Group 29, assembles data and information on the family householder who settled in the U.S. Record Group 59 assembled information on individuals who traveled back to countries of origin during certain periods. For countries of origin, certain Caribbean countries may contain immigration records in their archives, and in certain instances, records may be located in the country who formerly possessed control of a respective island. So this is all information that one would need to know, because you're going to have to know whether these documents are in English or whether they require translation. And then another level of research: how do you access documents that may or may not be online, that may be in another country? Relatives and ancestors may have worked on the Panama Canal. So there is a necessity to review the Panama Canal Zone records, generally 1851 to 1960, Record Group 185, National Archives Record Group. There are some recorded, for instance, for Danish holdings, particularly the islands of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. In Record Group 55, these records relate to, Danish administration through 1917 and American administration through 1957. Records may supply data from a variety of sources, military, newspapers, police, etc. Various sources, archives, libraries, and historical centers are maintained by many Caribbean countries. Patience is required, however. They usually have, as I said, smaller staffs, different restrictions on access to information depending upon condition issues, and other issues. They also may have different requirements in terms of whether or not material can be photographed or how data can be accessed. So you really have to know the individual situation, and what may or may not be going on in a particular locale. Some individuals never applied for United States citizenship. Once an individual thought that he or she may want to become a citizen of the United States once they immigrated, there was usually initially, especially in the earlier part of the country, a 5-year period in which, they could apply. But some people follow through, and other people may have acquired a declaration of intent, at least the application process, but they may not have followed through, and so therefore you may need to look at alien registration materials. The earlier part of the 20th century, of course, through, as I said, 1924, and I'll probably repeat that again, immigration was fairly open. So, as I said, in all phases of your genealogical quest, it is necessary to collect all of the information you can from family and your own personal archives and research, and especially collecting oral history, because those little you never know what information you're going to arrive at. You never know what oral histories and other documents may tell you. But they all together, you're assembling, an important overall picture of your family, who they were, where they resided, what cultural information, you may need to know. It is estimated that 4 million or more individuals were transported to the Caribbean during the 15th to 19th centuries. Some migrated from one island to another at various times for various reasons. Slavery ended in 1834 in many Caribbean islands, although there was a practice of apprenticeship, resulting in an additional 4-year commitment on the part of Black individuals, obligating their service until 1834. In many islands, the researchers need to know the mother's maiden name, especially in the instance where the mother and father were not married. Children were registered with the mother's maiden name. Several given first names were sometimes used by parents. Sometimes these names were used in full, and sometimes different ones were used alternatively. So also there is a preponderance of nicknames. So the task in trying to identify a person's given name or surname can be challenging. Especially in the early part of the 20th century, there was a practice of children born, here or in the Caribbean, being given 3 or 4 given names. Now we're used to, if somebody says to me, "What's your name?" I say Sharon Wilkins. I do have a middle name, but in the especially earlier part of the 20th century, going up to, a few decades ago, sometimes people had 3 or 4 given names that they used interchangeably. So sometimes if somebody asks them, what was their given name, they may say, Robert Jones. And then, but if their name was, Robert Hezekiah Eliezer Jones or whatever, sometimes they might use Robert, sometimes they might use Hezekiah, sometimes they might use Eliezer. So oral history and knowing, facts about the family as well as structural and institutional facts are important, because as you're researching, you may find these names interchanging, and it may be the same person, but you may not recognize it because of a different surname that appears. Of course, there are vital records, such as we discussed before. Birth records, of course, officially recorded in civil registration documents or birth information. But birth records also, in the Caribbean, it wasn't necessarily a process that we're used to here in terms of the official, birth certificate. Also, the child may have been registered in a parish or church record. So church documents, become important as well. In the Caribbean, civil registration or the adoption of vital records recordings occurred at different periods, and depending upon the island, um, not until the 19th century. So with regard to parish and church records, it is very important to note the European powers that may have colonized the island. For instance, church records from England would be in Anglican or Episcopal church records mainly, but also might be in Methodist records. If the colonizing entity was Holland, then records may appear in the Dutch Reformed Church. If the colonized entity was Spain or France, it would more likely be the Catholic Church. And in the case of Denmark, the Lutheran Church, Dutch Reformed Church, or the Catholic Church. So sometimes there was the presence of missionary churches also, which then would have been largely Baptist or Moravian. These documents may be found in libraries, archives, historical societies, museums, or the local family history library. The numbers and types of repositories vary from county to county and country to country, or some may have been established and assembled in the British archives. The types of possible records include slave baptisms, slave registers, church records including baptism, marriage, and burial records, civil registration records, wills, and deeds. Sometimes records can be found with historical and/or genealogical information in repositories of the colonizing nation, such as census records. But keep in mind that the records may have been created for purposes other than genealogy, and they may require translation. The culture and history of a place is also noteworthy. An example, for instance, when researching, if here we may say instead of regarding someone who has passed away, we may be looking for an obituary in a respective Caribbean island. They may want to help us look for the same document, but they may call it a memoriam. So these tiny little little pieces of information and kernels of information and definition are also important. And I talked already about the use of different names. There may be 3 or 4 surnames used interchangeably, and all of the surnames may not be recorded on a particular document. So, again, but this kind of piecing together comes with genealogical knowledge, research strategies and skills, and sophistication. Because after you're doing it for a number of years, it's easier to pick up on the nuances. In the Caribbean, especially going back decades, some people, as I said, had a variety of names. As I said, naturalization was usually filed within 5 years of residing in the United States. If a man became naturalized in the United States early on, in the early part of the 20th century especially, his wife automatically received her naturalization. And immigration, as I said, was fairly open through 1924. Okay, so, we talked about needing to know the cultural and history and social practices in respective countries, who colonized the country during and in what time frame, what documents may exist in languages other than English, and this may require translation. Knowledge of culture is key, because sometimes nicknames are also common, in Caribbean countries. generally, if a woman was not married and she gave birth to a child, the child was given the mother's surname, not necessarily the father's name. So all of these subtleties and nuances, are important. Terminology, is important, as I stated. Vital records here, in terms of civil registration in parts of the Caribbean, may be housed and conceived of, with different terminology. And, I talked a little bit about that. I told you that immigration was, fairly open through 1924. Prior to that date, naturalization could occur in a federal, state, or local court. When I was originally, and I'll give you an example from my own research, when I was looking for immigration records for my grandfather, as a modern day researcher, and early on in my genealogical quest, I just assumed because now it's a federal record. But in the early part of the 20th century, people could become, naturalized and file these papers in a federal, state, or local court. And before my experience and, knowledge of this particular research strategy, I did not know that. So when I first went and looked at the federal court and couldn't find anything, I was so dismayed. But then I went to the state court, and in less than 5 minutes, I had the documents in my hand. So, knowing the nuances and the strategies and the where and how information is compiled, again, especially if your roots are within the United States, it can be tricky, but certainly if your roots are outside of the United States, requires a different level of sophistication. Abolition of slavery, as we know, basically occurred in the Caribbean in 1834. Although, as I said, you have to know the particular situation because apprenticeship could have occurred for an additional 4 years. In 1838, some people remained in a respective island, and then some people left the island for various reasons, to work, for other kinds of situations. In fact, this migration helped to populate Central and South America. As people moved out of the Caribbean, sometimes they relocated in Central South America, or they came to the United States. So all of this nuanced material, needs to be considered. Many records are helpful in addition to those mentioned above: passenger lists, passport applications, as I said before, material in public archives, alien registration, and other other records. So there are many record sources available to us today. So I think I do have some specific information I've outlined in my notes. If some of you have specific information about archives or historical societies in various of the islands, I don't know that I have information in all of the islands, but if there are specific questions in terms of the library archives and the specific information, I may be able to help you. So in general, I hope that this presentation was helpful to all of you. I am pleased to have shared, this information with you. And I think now I will ask Sarah and Nancy to field the questions if if any of you, have questions that I may be helpful in answering. So again, thank you for your attention. Again, I apologize for the technological glitch, but we got the job done. So I'm very happy to note that.